Oh man, I've never tried to hold a beer, a clicker, and a microphone. I'm Parker Spielman. I'm part of the marketplace team at Lyft and really excited to share with you a little bit about how our dispatch systems work and how we tweak them to account for what actually happens in the real world. So we're going to talk about two things. I know there's three things up there. First, we'll give a background of the internals of how we actually choose the car that we assign to you. And then we'll talk about how we account for uncertainty in dispatch decisions, and we'll interleave that with talking about the biases in different approaches. So dispatch has two primary goals. The first is spatial optimization. So within a region, we want to optimize the supply and demand balance. And we define a region at Lyft as a contiguous geographic area where what happens in the region affects other people in the region. One way to think about this is you're in the same region with your buddy. If you're both standing next to each other, you request a car, one of you gets assigned a driver, and now that driver is no longer available to pick up your friend as well. And so San Francisco Bay Area is a region, LA is a region, New York is a region, they all operate independently. And this enables us to solve a global optimization problem for each region. Most of the talk will focus on spatial optimization, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how we extend this to account for a short-term future time horizon. Let's talk about how dispatch works. Unlike what my parents think, dispatch is not a large call center. And this is probably a good thing because I'm terrible at talking on the phone and might not still be working there if it was. But actually what happens is we solve what's called a dispatch cycle. As frequently as you can, we start the cycle by taking all the input in the problem. So we take all the riders who have requested rides, we take all the drivers, and then we generate options. What's important about this option space is that we generate a large enough set of options that it contains the optimal solution. But especially accounting for shared rides, which becomes a combinatorial problem of how do you match person A with B and C and evaluate this space, it's also important that we constrain this space so we can solve it quickly and efficiently. After we generate this set of possible options, then we move on to a filtering phase. And the goal of the filtering phase is we want to ensure that every dispatch we give is a good experience. And so you can think of this as a set of hard constraints so we don't offer anyone poor experiences that they wouldn't be happy with. After we have a set of valid options that pass our minimum set of criteria, we move on to scoring. And scoring is where we're going to spend the heart of the time today talking about, and this is where we can apply machine learning to do some really cool things and account for uncertainty. But before we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about solving. So this is how do we set up the problem to globally optimize across a whole region and figure out which drivers to assign to which passengers. The first constraint of how we do this is that when we solve, we can end up with the exact same state that we started with. So the world can stay the same. And there's three types of options we consider. The first are passengers or riders who have requested but haven't been assigned a driver yet. And they can remain that way. The second is open drivers. Drivers who are not on their way to pick someone up and don't have anyone in their car. And the third input into our problem is planned. So these are drivers who have been assigned one or more passengers to pick up. And then we augment this with all of the possible valid options that we scored. And if anything is better, we'll assign that dispatch. Now it's time for some math. So this is what we end up with. It's an integer linear program. If you're not a math person, that's okay. I will walk you through this. If you are, you can pay attention. But the main constraint that this problem says is we want to maximize the value of all the inputs in the system, but we want to make sure that each rider and each driver appears exactly once in the solution. And this makes sense, right? Because it wouldn't make sense to assign a rider to two drivers. So now that you kind of know how we solve this problem, let's talk about how we evaluate the scores. And the way this is going to work, we'll start with a really simple scenario, and then we'll slowly build on top of it to account for uncertainty over time. So the simplest case is for private rides. This is where you're being picked up and you're not sharing a car with anyone else. And what we can do is we can just minimize pickup time. So across all rides in the region, we want to give everyone the closest pickup. But this doesn't really scale to shared rides. And so we need to evaluate this approach slightly differently. And with shared rides, we want to minimize for cost and difference and distance. And you can think about shared rides. It's a cheaper ride-sharing product where you will take a ride with someone else who's going somewhat near your destination, and then we pass on that cost savings to the rider and to the passengers. But there are a couple biases with this approach. First thing is that it assumes people are somewhat linear proportionally sensitive to pickup time. So a trade-off between 1 and 2 minutes is the same to them as a trade-off between 12 and 13 minutes or 20 and 21 minutes. So this is a graph of conversion likelihood with respect to pickup time. And as you can see, people don't like to wait. And the longer they wait, the less likely it is that they're actually going to be there and wait for a driver to pick them up. So we need to account for this in our dispatching scoring. And we can do that by creating a simple conversion model. It might take into account pickup time, as well as some temporal and spatial features. And what we end up with is we change our optimization objective. We're no longer trying to minimize time, we're trying to maximize for the expected value in this system. Again, if you don't know math, it doesn't matter. There's two things we're trying to do. One, we want to choose things that are likely to happen. And the second thing we need to do is we need to find some way to value them so that we can decide which one we prefer. And so now we're going to walk through an example, and I'll show you how this changes the dispatch decision. What you can see here is we have 2 drivers and 2 riders in the system, and driver 2 is picking up passenger B in 5 minutes. Driver 1, right next to passenger A, going to pick up passenger A. But if you remember, passenger A has a really short pickup and isn't really sensitive. You might say, maybe he's going to text someone or look at Instagram. It doesn't matter if it's a minute or 2. But passenger B has a longer pickup. And so we want to find a way to maximize the overall likelihood of both of these pickups happening. And you can see here, even though the overall pickup time in the system is slightly larger, the outcome is more likely to occur. What are the trade-offs here? Well, we're trading off some of the savings on short pickups and passing them to farther away pickups where people are more sensitive. We're also minimizing the long tail, so the really bad experiences, because we care about those the most and those have the biggest impact on the system. And let's see. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about modeling bias. And even getting a simple model like this to work is actually quite challenging. So this is Phoenix, if you've ever been there. And this is a map. We call them geohashes, but in essence, it's small areas. And it shows for a 5-minute pickup, what is the likelihood of that pickup happening? Pink means super likely, maybe 100%. Purple, unlikely. And you can see it's not very continuous. And in fact, maybe you cross the street and you get a very different likely outcome. So there's a couple of reasons for this. This model itself was trained using a decision tree. And we fed in location and we fed in geohash in 2 separate trainings as an input feature. And what ended up happening is the model overfit. So it's really bad at sampling, out-of-band sampling. This means that if the model tried to do something that wasn't part of the training data, it got it wrong. The other thing, if you think about, and what makes this problem really unique, is we're not just solving a classic ML prediction problem. The output of the ML prediction problem is the input into our optimization problem. So we're combining 2 very separate disciplines here in order to make smart decisions. We talked a little bit about conversion with regard to classic rides where we want to maximize. How do we expand this to account for shared rides? This is an example of a shared ride on a 1-dimensional plane. There's a driver, it's picking up the first person, driving 8 more minutes, picking up the second person, and then dropping them both off at their house and their neighbors. So we actually, that 8 minutes, we could have had to send a second car to pick up person B. Instead, they can ride together, which is awesome, right? But person B has to wait 9 minutes. And he might not be willing to do that. And he might cancel. And if person B cancels, then this driver is driving person A a total of 16 minutes by themselves to their house. And that's not ideal. And so what we want to do is we want to change this objective to not maximize for the highest value, but optimize for the highest expected value. And so we'll walk through this example. Again, we got drivers, they're in the cars. If you're not following or you're falling asleep. We got passengers, and the highest value outcome here is where the D1 picks up A, picks up B, drops off B, and drops off A. And we make it really simple. Let's assume that every mile a driver drives, we pay them $1. So if A went to his house right here, the driver's paid 7 miles. And if B went to her house, she's paid $6. If we share that ride, we end up with a total cost for the trip of $9, and so we make $4 in savings. And that's how kind of shared rides pricing works. But there's a problem. The likelihood of both passenger A and passenger B waiting around to be picked up is super low, 35%. Can we do better? Here's an example where the other driver that is an option picks up B first and then A. And so passenger A gets picked up in 6 minutes. And in essence, we're able to, even though it's a slightly less efficient route, achieve a much higher expected outcome and save more money. And so that's what we'll choose. This is how we formulate the problem. Again, here's math. I'll explain it to you for if you don't want to read the equation. Pretty much what we're accounting for is some likelihood of an event happening. This would be that person A and person B are picked up and get driven to their houses by a specified driver. We assign a value to that. And then on the right side here, we have like the inverse of that. What happens if one or more of them don't get picked up, and then a loss function? So if you remember, we're solving this optimization problem, and a simple way to think about that is if we're just assigning private rides, it's a bipart matching problem. So you have the choice of which driver you assign to which person and a bunch of values on the edges of the graph. And the loss function is important because we can use it to bias to ensure that we always pick people up. Otherwise, no one would get picked up. We all try to leave. We'd be stuck here listening to more talks all night. So this loss function is super important and enables us to tune a little bit more the objective. But we've really talked about so far the summation of outcomes where there's one outcome. But in the shared rides case, it's a little bit more complicated because it's not an all or nothing scenario. In this example, we have 2 passengers, and in our most likely, in our desired outcome, they both get picked up and taken to their house. In our most unlikely outcome, they both don't get picked up, they cancel, and no one is picked up, and there's loss of wasted resource in the system. But it could also be the case that one of them cancels, or the other cancels. And so we end up with 4 outcomes for 2 passengers. You can imagine that the number of outcomes also grow the more passengers you're trying to put in a ride. And so when we think about how we calculate expected cost savings, we actually need to calculate all the different possibilities here, the value that each of them has, and their likelihood. And so this is how we adapt to maximize for expected cost savings. So far, we've talked about accounting for rider sensitivity to pickup times and making trips happen. But we also need to take into account the other side of the equation, that drivers don't always accept dispatches. So even if we're maximizing for the expected value, we may never get any of those values. And this is a graph that shows you that every time a driver doesn't accept, the ride itself needs to go back into the system. We do all the 6 steps we showed you, where we take the inputs, we generate the options, we filter, we score, and we solve and assign new dispatch options. This takes time. And that whole time, the rider is waiting. That's what happens when you request. We're going through the stage, we're trying to find you a driver, and we keep trying until we do. But we want to maximize the likelihood that the driver we send the dispatch to wants to take you home or wherever else you're going. And so we need to incorporate this into conversion. So what I'm going to do now, I'll talk through an example that uses pictures. If you like math better, we'll show you that afterwards. What we've talked about so far is this right here, where the driver accepts and you get picked up as long as the rider doesn't cancel. But there's this probability the driver lapses. And then either the rider is done tired of waiting, he cancels, or there's enough time and we find a new driver and that driver might take them to their destination. But what happens is this could go on forever. And it's really expensive to calculate an infinite series. And so we need to find some way to represent this in a closed form solution, make some assumptions, and do something that we can solve in a very small amount of time. What we end up doing is we assume 2 things. First, the likelihood of the driver acceptance, no matter which driver we're sending it to, no matter which round in that series, is the same. And then we assume that you're insensitive, so over time, every time we try, maybe there's a 90% chance you'll wait for the next try. Now, these assumptions aren't always true, but it helps us get one step closer to optimizing and taking into account the uncertainty in the real world. The last thing that we're going to talk about, and then we'll be done with all the math for today, is how do we extend this to account for a temporal horizon? So what we've talked about right now is maximizing the riders and drivers currently in the system. But they're not always in the system at the time you're making a decision. Drivers can go offline. New people will request and need to be picked up. And so we want to take that into account also. And we can do that with dispatch because it's one of the most powerful positioning levers because it's free. Or in essence, we're using riders who need to go to different places to move cars around the system. And so what you see here on the right, the closest car. Let's assume that that car is from an undersupplied area. Maybe it's from right here after this talk when you all leave. And it's the closest pickup time. But there are other cars we can draw from that aren't too much different from a place that has a better supply balance. And so we can use dispatch to shift the overall supply balance in the region. But this also has some real challenges. The first challenge being that how do we assign the value between 3 minutes and 5 minutes? If we assign it an infinite value, we actually end up in a scenario that's worse than any of these because we're no longer maximizing for pickup time, which is something that we're really sensitive to as people, maximizing for some arbitrary second metric. The other thing that we need to take into account is these values can have additive or cancellatory effects, and we want a stable solution so that over time, we're not re-dispatching to different people, and we can give you the car that originally made the most sense and that remains the best outcome in the system. So this is a little window into how dispatching works. There's a lot more nuance to how these values are prescribed and how we calculate the expected probability of these events happening. There's also a ton of work just to build a system that's able to do this really quickly and accurately. One thing to think about again is that we operate in regions, and so we can't test this like a lot of other machine learning approaches where you feed it a lot of data and you learn over time and you build smarter models. And this is because what happens to one person affects the other, and we have to account for network effects and develop more complicated experimentation strategies. And we need to understand the effect that each of these modeling changes does to the system and the overall balance. And so there are a ton of awesome people involved in this work, and there's a ton of amazing work ongoing now to make the systems even smarter so we send you the car that you're most likely to be picked up with. And that's good, right? So that's it. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I don't know where Mark is. Hey.
Question.
Yeah.
When you try to assign a value to like a customer's waiting, you have everything like between 0 and 5 minutes. Oh, that's the cost of 0. And then after 5 minutes, cancel. And also, are you going much granular? Like all different customers have different behavior. Like this customer tends to cancel really quick, and other customers.
Got it. So there were two questions. The first is, how do we think about users waiting? And one of the important things of all the different algorithms and models that we're applying is that they're continuous and smooth. Because otherwise you end up with really weird behavior as state changes. Maybe a rider gets picked up and a feature value changes, or in these different models. And that isn't helpful because it's an input into the optimization problem. The other question is, do we personalize on different users? And say, we know this person's really likely to cancel. We know someone else a little bit less sensitive. The answer to that is we want the system to be fair. And so we do not train on historic data and user-specific features to penalize users because we want to produce the optimal solution for everyone. But again, we include temporal features and we include location-specific features. So if you live way out in the boonies and there aren't many cars, it takes a while to get everywhere anyway, you're less sensitive than if you live downtown and you're trying to get to work during rush hour.
How do you choose regions?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
How do you choose regions? The regions.
Choose the regions. You know what? I have no idea. But the regions kind of represent the cities that are densely populated that Lyft operates in.
How do you deal with the route optimization anomalies like Market Street? So I take a lot of Lyft and Uber, and I spend a lot of time trying to maximize or minimize my time. And Market Street's always a problem. So I'm always like moving myself from point A to point B to be on the right side of Market Street to enable my likelihood of getting a good ride that's not going to make me wait a lot.
That's an awesome question. So there are two answers for that. The first is we innovate with product constraints. One of the ways we do that, if anyone has taken a shared saver ride, in that product, we actually give you the opportunity to walk. And so we'll optimize for the routing to maybe put you on the opposite side of Market Street or somewhere that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that we can do is we can build more sophisticated routing engines that compute what is the distance and what is the time, because in any of these models, they're really important features in calculating the ETA from wherever you're going to wherever you're going. And there's an amazing team that's building all of those actual routing models and the routing engine. She's in charge. I don't know.
Sorry. You pass that down. Thanks.
I saw your model doesn't have an error term. So how do you optimize the probabilities over time?
So we don't have an error turn kind of because this isn't the end value that we're using. It's the input into something else. And so another subtle difference between a lot of applications of machine learning and how we're using it in this problem is we have different preferences. So we have the tree model that I showed for Phoenix. Let's assume that it was super accurate, 80% accuracy, right? But if it's not continuous, then it has other negative effects that cause dispatches to be reassigned, or as people enter the system, things to thrash. And so we're optimizing for training models as an input, and that's where we deal with the error terms. And then we use that model to, in the actual dispatch decision, as an input into the optimization problem.
Pass that down. Thank you.
Last question. Sorry, everybody, but we can talk after this.
When you design any experiment to evaluate any strategy or changes in the features, what's the challenges of doing random selection of geohash within the city or region?
So geohash maybe isn't the ideal model. Again, because we have different objectives here than some other uses of machine learning, we might want to train on a per regional level, or we might train on a global level across all regions and apply boosting and other subtleties based on neighborhoods. So spatial smoothing is really important. I think that's it, but thank you guys.